She never thought her son would step foot inside the mansion that paid for their survival. For years, Mariah scrubbed the marble floors, polished the silver, and pressed the Millionaire's suits with a quiet dignity that no one ever noticed. She was the shadow in a house of light, working silently while her little boy stayed home with neighbors. But when her babysitter suddenly canceled, she had no choice but to bring her son with her. Nervous and ashamed, she expected whispers, disapproving glares, maybe even the loss of her job. What she never expected was for her boss, the man who barely acknowledged her existence, to kneel down in front of her child and change both of their lives forever. Mariah's hands trembled as she adjusted the strap of her worn-out handbag while holding her son. Elijah's tiny palm, in hers the morning sun, was barely awake, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement as they walked toward the bus stop, and she could feel her stomach turning with every step. This was the first time she had ever dared to bring him with her to the place where she spent most of her days cleaning after people who barely remembered her name. She had begged the neighbor to watch him, but the woman had her own troubles, and with no family to call and no money for daycare, Mariah had been left with no choice. Elijah, only 6 years old, looked up at her with those wide brown eyes that carried both innocence and questions. He never spoke them aloud, but she knew what he was thinking. Why couldn't he have a life like the kids he saw on television, with toys spilling across shiny floors and birthday parties filled with laughter instead of silence? Their bus rattled down the road, and every bump made her heart race faster. The mansion she worked in was not just a house, it was another world. Marble steps, chandeliers, so bright they looked like they were stolen from the stars, and rooms so big they could swallow the tiny apartment she and Elijah called home. She hated that he would see this world because she feared it would remind him of everything they did not have. But she also prayed, maybe, just maybe, it would light a fire in him, a dream to one day build a better life. When they finally arrived at the iron gates of the estate, Mariah felt her chest tighten. She whispered instructions to Elijah: stay close, stay quiet, and do not touch anything. He nodded obediently, clutching her hand tighter than ever before as they stepped. Inside, the air seemed different, scented with roses and expensive polish, the kind of air that told her she did not belong. The head housekeeper gave her a sharp glance at the boy, but did not say a word. Mariah exhaled in silent relief as they hurried toward the service entrance. Elijah's eyes darted everywhere, drinking in the vast garden with fountains and statues, a small mouth falling open, and all Mariah wanted to cover his eyes. She wanted to protect him from knowing what life looked like for people born on the other side of the world. The family who lived there was rarely home, but today was different. Today, the millionaire himself was inside. Mariah had seen him only a handful of times, tall, sharp, dressed, always rushing past without so much as a nod in her direction. His presence filled the halls like thunder, silent, but impossible to ignore. Her hands shook as she began her morning routine, scrubbing the tiled kitchen floor, while Elijah sat quietly on a stool, his little feet dangling. He was so well behaved that it broke her heart. He deserved to run, play, laugh, but instead he sat still, knowing that his mother's job depended on it. Then something happened that sent her pulse racing. Footsteps, strong and steady, echoed through the hall, and before she could gather her breath, the millionaire appeared in the doorway. His eyes fell first on her, then on Elijah. Mariah's soul nearly left her body. She stumbled to her feet, wiping her hands nervously on her apron, already rehearsing apologies. She did not know whether she would be fired on the spot, whether she would be told never to return, but instead of anger, his expression softened as he crouched down until he was eye level with her son. Elijah flinched, pressing himself against Mariah's leg, but the man smiled, a gentle smile unlike any she had ever seen on his face before. "What's your name?" he asked, and Elijah whispered so softly Mariah could barely hear him. "Elijah, sir." The man chuckled. "No need for sir, just Elijah is fine." And then he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small wrapped chocolate, and placed it in Elijah's hand. Mariah's eyes burned with tears because no one had ever shown her boy kindness in this house. In that moment, the marble walls and golden frames seemed to fade, and what remained was the simple human act of a powerful man kneeling before a child who had nothing. The gesture was small, but for Mariah, it felt like a crack in a universe, as if life had just opened a door she had never dared to knock on. She held her breath, wondering what this meant for her son's future, what it meant for her place in this house. Was it possible that this man who lived in luxury could see her child as more than a burden, more than the shadow of a housekeeper's life. And so, I ask you, if you were in Mariah's place, watching a man of unimaginable wealth kneel down to treat your child with kindness, would you believe it was just a fleeting moment, or would you dare to hope it could change everything? Mariah could hardly breathe as she watched Elijah clutch the chocolate in his small hand, as though it were a treasure. His eyes sparkled in a way she had not seen in so long, and it broke her heart that something so simple could bring him such joy. She wanted to thank the millionaire, but the words stuck in her throat. After all, what could a housekeeper say to a man whose wealth and power dwarfed her entire existence? The millionaire straightened up, his gaze meeting hers, and for the first time since she had started working in the mansion, he truly looked to her, not as a servant, not as someone invisible, but as a woman and a mother. His voice was calm when he asked, "Does he come here often?" She shook her head, quickly explaining that this was the first time she had brought Elijah, that her usual babysitter had fallen through, that she had not wanted to trouble anyone, but she had no other choice. She expected him to scold her, to remind her of the rules, but instead he simply nodded as though he understood and said children should not have to sit in silence all day. Let him explore a little if he likes. The word stunned her, and she thought she must have misheard him, because never in her years working there had any member of the family suggested kindness toward the staff or their families. But before she could reply, he turned and walked away, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than thunder. Elijah tugged her apron and whispered, "Mama can I really explore?" She bit her lip, torn between the fear of disobedience and the strange hope his words had planted. After a moment she nodded, but warned him to stay close and respectful. Elijah slid off the stool and tiptoed through the massive kitchen, his little hands tracing the smooth counters, his eyes wide with amazement at the refrigerators taller than him and the rows of sparkling utensils. It was as though he had stepped into a fairy tale, and for Mariah, the sight of her son marveling at the world she only served was both beautiful and painful. Throughout the morning, she tried to focus on her chores, scrubbing, polishing, dusting, but her eyes constantly darted to Elijah. He peeked in the library, his tiny fingers brushing against books older than she was. He wandered into the sitting room, where sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating furniture too fine for touching, and everywhere he went, Mariah's heart followed, afraid that one mistake would cost her everything. Hours passed, and Elijah remained quiet and respectful, which filled her with both pride and sorrow, because he was a child who had learned too early to shrink himself to fit into spaces that were never meant for him. When lunchtime came, Mariah expected to retreat to the servants' corner with a simple sandwich, as she always did, but something extraordinary happened. The millionaire appeared again, this time carrying a tray himself. Mariah froze, unsure whether she should bow or apologize, but he walked past her and set the tray on the long polished dining table. He called to Elijah, "Come here, young man," and Mariah's heart nearly stopped. Elijah glanced at her for permission, and when she nodded, he approached timidly. The man lifted him onto a chair and slid a plate in front of him, a meal far richer than anything Elijah had ever tasted. Tender chicken, fresh breadfruit cut into neat slices. Mariah stood at the doorway, unable to move, watching her son eat like a prince, while the man who owned it all sat across from him, asking gentle questions. "What do you like to read? What games do you play? What dreams do you have?" Elijah's answers were shy but honest, and with every word the millionaire listened intently, as if her boy's voice mattered more than the endless meetings and business calls that usually consumed his days. Mariah's chest ached. She had spent years swallowing her pride, cleaning floors and scrubbing toilets, to give Elijah food on the table and clothes on his back. Yet here was a man whose wealth could buy kingdoms, giving her son not just food but attention, respect, dignity. It was overwhelming. After lunch, the man finally turned to her and said, "You should bring him more often. Children need to see the world beyond their walls." Mariah nodded, though inside her heart screamed with confusion and fear. She could not understand why he was being so kind. Was it pity? Was it guilt? Or was it something else altogether? As the day ended and she held Elijah's hand, walking back through the grand gates, she felt torn between gratitude and suspicion. She had learned long ago that nothing in life was free, that kindness from the wealthy often came with hidden strings. But when she glanced at Elijah, his eyes brighter, his steps lighter, she could not deny that today had given him something she never could hope. And so she asked herself a question that lingered long into the night. Could she trust this unexpected gesture to be genuine, or was it only the beginning of something far more complicated? And I ask you, if you were in Mariah's position, would you accept the kindness of someone who lived in a world so different from yours? Or would you protect your child by keeping him away no matter how much it hurt? The following week, Mariah woke before dawn, her nerves rattling like loose glass as she prepared Elijah's clothes. She told herself over and over that she should not bring him again, that it was safer to leave him at home, even if it meant begging another neighbor for help. But when she looked at his eager little face, asking if he could come see the mansion again, she could not bring herself to say no. So she took his hand, and together they returned through the towering iron gates, this time without the same fear, though her heart still beat hard enough to shake her ribs. The staff noticed, of course. Whispers trailed after her as she walked past with her son by her side. Some of the other housekeepers frowned, others shook their heads. One even muttered under her breath that this would not last. But Mariah ignored them, focusing instead on her duties as Elijah followed quietly like a shadow. It was not long before the millionaire appeared again, as though he had been expecting them. He smiled when he saw Elijah, and for a moment Mariah thought she glimpsed something softer in his eyes, something almost paternal. He crouched to Elijah's level once more and asked, "Did you read the book I gave you?" Mariah's breath caught. She had not known about a book. But Elijah nodded proudly and pulled from his small backpack a children's storybook with golden letters on the cover. She had not even noticed when he had tucked it away last time. The millionaire ruffled Elijah's hair and asked, "Which part did you like best?" Elijah grinned, showing the missing gap in his teeth, and said, "The boy who built a boat to sail across the world, because he was brave." The man's smile widened, and Mariah realized he was not just being polite. He was investing in her son's mind, in his dreams and ways she never thought possible. The rest of the day unfolded like a scene from another life. Elijah explored the gardens with the millionaire walking beside him, pointing out rare flowers and teaching him their names. He showed him how the fountains worked and even let him feed the koi fish in the pond. Mariah kept her distance, torn between awe and unease. Every glance she stole at her son filled her with pride, yet every glance at the man filled her with questions. Why would someone so powerful take interest in a child who had nothing to offer? By mid-afternoon, when Mariah paused in the laundry room, folding crisp white shirts, she heard laughter echoing from the courtyard. Elijah's laughter, high and free, and the deeper chuckle of the millionaire. Together, the sound stirred something inside her, something she had buried long ago, the hope that her son might have a chance at a life brighter than her own. Later that evening, as the workday ended and the sun melted into the horizon, the millionaire called Mariah aside, her knees nearly buckled with fear, certain he was about to reprimand her, but his tone was steady and warm. He said, "Elijah is a remarkable boy. You should be proud." She stammered out a thank you, unsure what else to say. He hesitated, as though choosing his next words carefully, then asked, "Do you ever think about his education?" Startled, Mariah explained that Elijah went to the local public school, but resources were thin, and she worried about keeping him on track. The millionaire nodded and then spoke words that struck her heart like lightning. "I could arrange for him to attend a better school if you would allow it." Her breath caught, her throat tightening until she could hardly speak. She wanted to cry, to scream, to fall to her knees, because she had spent every night worrying about Elijah's future, and now here was a solution dropped at her feet. But the weight of it terrified her, because nothing came without cost. What would this man expect in return? Would Elijah lose himself in a world so different from their own? Would she be left behind? Her silence stretched on until finally she whispered, "I will think about it." He gave a small, respectful nod, as though he understood her hesitation, and then excused himself, leaving her shaking with confusion. That night, as she and Elijah rode the bus home, he leaned against her shoulder, whispering, "Mama, do you think I could really go to that big school like in the movies?" She kissed his forehead, holding back tears, and told him, "Maybe one day, baby, maybe one day." But inside her mind churned with doubt and fear. She wanted to give him the world, but she also wanted to protect him from being hurt, from hoping too much, from losing himself in promises that might vanish like smoke. And so she lay awake long after Elijah had fallen asleep, replaying the millionaire's words again and again in her head, torn between a mother's desperate dreams and a woman's unshakable caution. And so I ask you, if you were in Mariah's shoes, would you trust a wealthy man's offer to shape your child's future, or would you guard your heart and refuse even if it meant closing the door on an opportunity that might never come again. Mariah could not escape the thoughts that consumed her after that day. Every sound in the mansion, every polished surface, every scent of roses in the hallways seemed to whisper the same question: was this an opportunity or a trap? For days, she moved through her work like a shadow torn between gratitude and suspicion, but Elijah did not share her fears. He woke every morning with a new light in his eyes, asking if he could go with her again, and though she wanted to shield him, she could not deny him that joy, so she brought him each time, and each time the millionaire greeted him as if he had been waiting. The man seemed to carve time from his busy schedule just to speak to Elijah, reading with him in the library, teaching him chess in the drawing room, walking with him through the endless gardens, while Mariah watched from afar, her chest aching with a mix of pride and unease. She had never seen her son so alive, so curious, so brave, but she had also never seen her world collide so violently with another. The staff grew restless. Some whispered that Mariah was playing dangerous games. Others claimed she was using her son to climb higher than her place, and the weight of their stares pressed on her every day. She ignored them, focusing on her work, but inside she feared they might be right, because when she saw Elijah sitting in a leather chair laughing with the millionaire, she wondered if she too was being drawn into something bigger than herself. One afternoon, the millionaire called her aside. In the study, his voice low and calm, he asked Mariah, "Have you thought about what I said about his schooling?" Her hands trembled as she folded a cloth against her apron. She admitted she had thought of nothing else, but she did not know if it was right. The man leaned back in his chair, studying her with eyes that seemed to see past her walls. He said, "Mariah, I know what it means to grow up without chances, and I know what it means when someone finally gives you one." His voice carried weight like truth, carved from pain, and for the first time, she wondered if his wealth had not always been there, if perhaps he too had once been a boy looking at a world out of reach. He continued, "I do not offer this out of pity. I offer it because your son deserves it, because he is brilliant, and because with the right tools he can build a life far beyond these walls." Tears stung her eyes as she tried to speak, but no words came. The offer was too big, too generous, too frightening. After work, she and Elijah sat on the bus in silence until he finally asked, "Mama, why do you look so sad? If he wants to help me, isn't that good?" She kissed the top of his head, whispering, "Yes, baby, it is good. But sometimes even good things can be heavy." He looked confused, but she knew he could not understand the weight of decisions that could change everything. Days stretched into weeks, and slowly the millionaire's influence grew. One evening, he sent a driver to take them home, sparing Elijah the long ride on the bus. Another day, he gifted him a backpack filled with notebooks and crayons, items so simple, yet so out of reach for Mariah to buy. Without sacrificing meals, Elijah clutched them as though they were treasures, and she could not bring herself to refuse them, though guilt gnawed at her heart. She worried what the neighbors would say, what the world would think, what line she was crossing without even realizing it. Yet each time she looked at her son smile, she felt a part of her heart whisper, "Maybe this is the miracle you have been praying for. Maybe this is how doors open." But with every act of kindness, her fear grew louder too, because nothing in her life had ever come without a cost. And though the millionaire never asked for anything in return, she wondered when the moment would come, when he would reveal the reason for his generosity. One night, she sat at the small kitchen table of their apartment, staring at the envelope he had given her. Inside was a scholarship form for one of the best private schools in the city. Tuition fully covered, transportation provided, uniforms paid. She should have felt joy, but instead her hand shook so violently she nearly dropped it. She imagined Elijah walking into classrooms filled with children who had never known hunger, children who had never worn the same shoes until holes ate through them. She imagined him being mocked, pitted, shaped into something she could not recognize. But she also imagined him learning, growing, becoming someone who could finally break the chains of poverty that had bound her family for generations. She wept silently that night, torn between love and fear. And I ask you, if you were standing at that kitchen table with that envelope in your hands, would you take the leap of faith and trust in the kindness of a man whose world was not your own? Or would you tear it apart to protect the fragile piece of normalcy you had left? Mariah sat at the kitchen table for days, staring at the scholarship envelope, unable to decide whether it was a blessing or a curse. She prayed at night, whispering to God for guidance, asking whether this was truly an answer to years of sacrifice or a trap that would steal her son from her. But as Elijah sat across from her at their chipped wooden table, practicing letters in his notebook with a stub of a pencil, she realized that the answer was already in his smile. He deserved more than scraps of hope. He deserved a chance to dream. And so with trembling hands, she filled out the form, signed her name, and sealed the envelope the next morning. She gave it to the millionaire. Without looking him in the eye, he accepted it with quiet respect and said simply, "You've made the right choice." Weeks passed in a blur as preparations were made. Elijah was fitted for uniforms, his books delivered to their small apartment, a bus arranged to pick him up each morning, and though excitement glowed in his eyes, Mariah's chest ached with fear. She worried that he would not fit and that the other children would see the holes in his shoes, the cracks in his confidence. But when the first day arrived, Elijah stood tall, in his new blazer, his smile brighter than the sun, and as he hugged her tightly before boarding the bus, she whispered, "Be brave, my son," and he nodded as though he had been waiting his whole life to hear those words. When she arrived at the mansion later that morning, whispers followed her sharper than ever. Some of the staff accused her of using her son to gain favor. Others muttered that it was only a matter of time before the kindness turned sour. But Mariah kept her head down, focusing on her work, though inside she feared they might be right. Yet every evening, when Elijah returned with stories of new books, new friends, new teachers who encouraged him, she felt her heart swell with pride. For the first time in years, hope outweighed fear. The millionaire often asked her about Elijah's progress, checking on his grades, asking what subjects he liked most, sometimes even inviting Elijah over after school to share what he had learned at the mansion library. And Mariah could not deny the strange bond forming between them. It frightened her and comforted her all at once. One evening after dinner, Elijah sat at their small table, excitedly telling her about a science project his class was working on. His hands waved in the air, his eyes gleamed with fire, and Mariah realized she had never seen him so alive. This was the boy she had dreamed of raising, confident, curious, unafraid. But in the same breath, she worried, what if all of this disappeared? What if the millionaire changed his mind? What if life reminded them again that the poor were not meant to touch the stars? Her fears grew heavier when the neighborhood began to notice. Some neighbors looked at her with envy, others with suspicion. One woman even asked her outright, "What did you have to give him in return?" Mariah felt her cheeks burn with shame. She wanted to scream that it was nothing, that she had given nothing but her trust, but the doubt planted itself inside her mind, gnawing at her. She began to pull away from the millionaire, avoiding his gaze, speaking to him only when necessary. Though his kindness never faltered, he noticed her distance one afternoon and asked softly, "Mariah, do you think I would hurt your boy?" She froze, staring at him, unable to answer. He sighed and said, "I know what it feels like to be judged, to have people assume the worst. But believe me, when I say this, I see him as the son." I never had. Her chest clenched with shock. And before she could respond, Elijah burst into the room, holding up a paper from school with a gold star shining on top. The millionaire knelt and hugged him tightly, pride glowing in his eyes, as if Elijah truly was his own. For a moment, Mariah felt something shift deep inside her, walls crumbling under the weight of genuine care. But still fear lingered, for she knew life had never been so generous without demanding something in return. And so she lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, torn between faith and suspicion. And I ask you, if you were Mariah, would you silence the doubts of the world and trust the man who had given your son wings? Or would you keep waiting for the day those wings might be ripped away? The weeks turned into months, and Mariah watched her son transform before her eyes. Elijah, who had once sat silently in the corner while she scrubbed floors, now returned home each day with stories of books he had devoured, experiments he had conducted, and dreams he had begun to form. He spoke of becoming a doctor one night, an engineer the next, and sometimes even a teacher, so he could help kids like himself. And each time he spoke, Mariah felt her heart expand with pride. When the neighborhood began to notice, some neighbors looked at her with envy, others with suspicion. One woman even asked her outright, "What did you have to give him in return?" Mariah felt her cheeks burn with shame. She wanted to scream that it was nothing, that she had given nothing but her trust, but the doubt planted itself inside her mind, gnawing at her. She began to pull away from the millionaire, avoiding his gaze, speaking to him only when necessary. Though his kindness never faltered, he noticed her distance one afternoon and asked softly, "Mariah, do you think I would hurt your boy?" She froze, staring at him, unable to answer. He sighed and said, "I know what it feels like to be judged, to have people assume the worst. But believe me, when I say this, I see him as the son." I never had her chest clench with shock. And before she could respond, Elijah burst into the room, holding up a paper from school with a gold star shining on top. The millionaire knelt and hugged him tightly, pride glowing in his eyes, as if Elijah truly was his own. For a moment, Mariah felt something shift deep inside her, walls crumbling under the weight of genuine care. But still fear lingered, for she knew life had never been so generous without demanding something in return. And so she lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, torn between faith and suspicion. And I ask you, if you were Mariah, would you silence the doubts of the world and trust the man who had given your son wings? Or would you keep waiting for the day those wings might be ripped away? The weeks turned into months, and Mariah watched her son transform before her eyes. Elijah, who had once sat silently in the corner while she scrubbed floors, now returned home each day with stories of books he had devoured, experiments he had conducted, and dreams he had begun to form. He spoke of becoming a doctor one night, an engineer the next, and sometimes even a teacher, so he could help kids like himself. And each time he spoke, Mariah felt her heart expand with pride. But alongside that pride lived the gnawing shadow of fear. She still did not understand why the millionaire had been so generous, why he had chosen her son out of all the children in the world, what had made him open his heart to a boy who came from nothing. The answer came on an evening thick with rain, the mansion windows blurred with water as thunder rolled across the sky. Mariah was finishing her chores when the millionaire called her into his study. She entered nervously, clutching her apron, but he gestured for her to sit, his face heavy with something she had never seen before, sorrow. He began to speak slowly, telling her of his own childhood, how he too had grown up in poverty, how his mother had worked as a maid cleaning houses much like Mariah, how she had carried him on buses late at night when she could not afford childcare, how she had dreamed of sending him to school but had never been able to afford it. His voice cracked as he admitted that she had died young, worn down by exhaustion, before she could ever see what her son would become. Mariah sat, frozen, tears spilling from her eyes as she listened, every word cutting in her soul, because it was as though he were telling her own story. His eyes glistened as he said, "When I saw Elijah sitting in that kitchen, it was like looking at myself all over again, and I swore I would not let history repeat itself." Mariah could not speak, her throat tight with grief and gratitude. She wanted to thank and to scream, to sob, but all she could do was nod as he continued, "You see, this is not charity. This is redemption for the boy I once was and the mother I lost. Elijah is a reminder that greatness can come from anywhere if only someone believes." Mariah pressed a hand to her chest, overwhelmed by the truth. For the first time, she realized his kindness had not been born from pity or pride, but from pain and love, the pain of a child who had once needed saving, and the love of a man determined to save another. Elijah appeared in the doorway, just then, holding the chessboard he had been practicing with. He looked between them, confused by the silence. The millionaire wiped his eyes quickly and smiled. "Come here, young man. Let's see if you can beat me today." Elijah laughed, rushing to the table, and Mariah stood in the corner, watching them play, her heart finally settling into peace. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was the miracle she had prayed for. And from that day on, the mansion did not feel like a place of strangers. It felt like a place where her son belonged, where his dreams were nourished, where his sacrifices were finally seen. And though the world outside still whispered, though neighbors still doubted, Mariah no longer listened, because she had seen the truth in the millionaire's eyes, the truth that kindness could be real, that broken pasts could weave into brighter futures, that hope was not foolish but necessary. Elijah thrived at school, winning awards, bringing home books filled with stars and notes of praise, and each success was not just his but hers, and the millionaire's too, a shared victory born of resilience, pain, and love. The pain of a child who had once needed saving, and the love of a man determined to save another. Elijah appeared in the doorway, just then, holding the chessboard he had been practicing with. He looked between them, confused by the silence. The millionaire wiped his eyes quickly and smiled. "Come here, young man. Let's see if you can beat me today." Elijah laughed, rushing to the table, and Mariah stood in the corner, watching them play, her heart finally settling into peace for the first time in years. She allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was the miracle she had prayed for, and from that day on, the mansion did not feel like a place of strangers. It felt like a place where her son belonged, where his dreams were nourished, where her sacrifices were finally seen. And though the world outside still whispered, though neighbors still doubted, Mariah no longer listened, because she had seen the truth in the millionaire's eyes, the truth that kindness could be real, that broken past could weave into brighter futures, that hope was not foolish but necessary. Elijah thrived at school, winning awards, bringing home books filled with stars and notes of praise, and each success was not just his, but hers and the millionaire's too, a shared victory born of resilience, pain, and love. Years later, as Elijah stood tall in his graduation gown, Mariah wept in the front row, the millionaire beside her clapping louder than anyone, his eyes filled with pride. And for that moment, she knew their lives had been forever changed by one simple gesture, a man kneeling before a boy and seeing not poverty, not limitation, but possibility. And so I leave you with this question: if someone reached out to change your life with no strings attached, only the echo of their own scars, would you find the courage to accept it, or would you let fear keep you from the miracle you had been waiting for all along?